more members join.
All right, why don't we go ahead and see if we can make some headway. Welcome to our Statute Review Subcommittee meeting for Friday, July 21st. I am Connie Williford. I am a member of the commission and the co-chair of the Statute Review Subcommittee. And I'm just going to start by asking LaTanya if you will review the meeting rules for members on how we will conduct business virtually, including that recording of meeting will be posted on the commission's YouTube channel.
Thank you, Judge Williford. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is LaTanya Lawrence, and I'm the program coordinator for the Georgia Child Support Commission. Today, I'll briefly discuss a few rules to help us navigate this meeting today via Zoom webinar. The Statute Review Subcommittee members and staff are designated as panelists within Zoom and can speak at any time during this meeting. All other participants are designated as attendees and are muted during the meeting, but may type a message in the Zoom chat feature if needed. The Child Support Commission does not hear public comment during any of its subcommittee meetings. Accordingly, we will not be accepting public comments today. However, you may leave a written comment for the commission at any time through the commission's website, and I'll place that in the chat, the website link. For your convenience, I just said that. But anyway, also anyone wishing to give public comment by speaking today may do so at any full Child Support Commission meeting, which the next one will be held on August 11th, 2013. And let's see here. And I'll also put that link for the commission's website in the chat. And in conclusion of today's meeting, staff will post the recording of our YouTube, on our YouTube channel, which is the Georgia Child Support Commission. And I will also place that channel in the chat for everyone to follow. And I will turn it back over to Judge Williford.
And I think it's August the 11th at 10 a.m. Is that correct?
Correct.
You may have said 2000.
Oh yeah, I said 2023.
Anyway, it's obviously this year.
Yeah.
On August the 11th, and it's 10 a.m. and that's hybrid. So some folks will appear, I guess, in person, and some folks will appear via Zoom. But
Right.
Our next full commission meeting schedule. All right, so I think we have established that we do not have a quorum. I believe that the draft of the minutes from the June 23rd meeting have been distributed to members for review. Are there any members present who have any edits that need to be discussed? All right, I don't think that we can vote on that. So let's just see what happens if other members show up today. If not, then we may to do some conducting of some e-votes, okay? So we'll skip over that for now, and I still don't see Judge Palmer, who was going to start the hour out with the low income deviation work. So don't give me.
And Judge, I'll see if I can reach Judge Palmer by phone.
Yeah. I was about to try to text him. All right, why don't we then just skip to the parenting time deviation? We were going to take that the second hour, but since Judge Palmer's not here, maybe we need to go ahead and get started on that. And when we left off at our last meeting, we were talking about the cross-credit method and multipliers, and which multiplier would be appropriate for Georgia at this time. And Dr. Venor had confirmed, I believe, that a 1.6 to 1.7 multiplier would be most accurate for 2023. And we had talked about Dr. Venor maybe doing some real world examples of those using 1.7 5, 6, and 7 maybe, or 1.6, 1.65, 1.7. Does that ring a bell, Dr. Venor?
Actually, I had to leave the meeting early last time, so
Okay.
Noelle gave me the instructions,
Okay.
and yes, and that's one of the memos is I just inserted them into those case examples earlier, and they make a negligible difference. I mean, if you look at the memo, don't really like that first case scenario because it's a higher, the mom's income is higher than the dad's income, which that's just the way it landed, but it's not always a typical case. And if you look at it, it's on page 2 of the memo. And you can see that when you use 150% multiplier, it makes it $22, and then 160, 23, 165, 24. Cross credit is with 170 is 24, and more of a more maybe example 4, which is a high income case where dad's income is more than mom's, and these were cases that committee members had given us.
Right.
And you see that the cross credit, which 150%, which is what most states use, is 880. 160 is 938, and then 165 is 967. Then 170 is 997. So it does make a difference depending on the income ratios.
Is there any information to help us decide if we were going to use the cross credit method? Which one of these, the 160%, 165%, or 170% would be most accurate for us here in Georgia?
Yeah, and I apologize. I had a really busy week, and I should have thought, another thing I should have looked up is my notes on that. So I will look them up. I just, I've got to find them on exactly why the variance.
Okay.
So West Virginia, uses 160%, and I know that was based on information that I provided them. So I am looking that up, and that's why you see my head turn. So sorry, I should have thought of it earlier, but I was kind of swamped last week and I didn't think about it till now.
Well, maybe at our next meeting, we could address which one of those would probably be the best percentage to use in Georgia if we were going to go with that method. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Venor regarding her case scenarios?
Pardon me. I have one quick question, Dr. Venor. So the column that says cross credit, that would be like, just for instance, for number 4, that 880 amount that then goes up as you increase the multiplier. But that 880 amount is the amount that the non-custodial parent would retain.
That's the amount that the dad would owe the mother after the credit.
Okay. Okay.
All right, so why don't you just explain the like from the beginning, kind of how it works instead of just jumping to the end. So there's 2 children. Dad makes $14,746. Mom makes $8,795. Mom's the primary custodial parent, and dad is going to exercise 153 overnights. Correct?
Correct.
And so Georgia sole means, what do you mean by that?
But there's no joint custody. There's no adjustment for parenting time.
So that would have been the NCP's obligation. And then if you do the cross credit, it brings that number down to 880 is what you're saying?
Correct.
So under our current system, dad would be paying $1,773 for 2 children based on those incomes. But if we account for the cross credit at 150%, with dad getting 153 overnights, his child support obligation goes from 1,773 to $880.
Correct.
And then for 160% to 938, obviously 165, 967, and 170, 997.
Yeah, and so the 150% is the traditional multiplier that the early data says it costs more to raise a child in 2 households, and that was based on older data that it's about 50% of those expenses are duplicated. That's transportation and housing using that 50%. And then I know that when I did the 160 to 170%, there was some that includes all housing expenses. So there's some question about whether all of them are duplicated, and transportation. I have to find my notes on what I included and what I excluded, because there's obviously some things that might not be duplicated, and I just need to find those notes, like transportation. Some of it would be duplicated, but if you're taking the kid to soccer, that's obviously not duplicated. So that's the reason that there's 160 to 165%. So.
Okay, and I just want to clarify, just really for everybody's understanding, the next columns then jump to the alternative methods, like those 4 sort of in the middle with those different, where it says cross credit is obviously cross credit. Then we jump to the old Michigan with that exponent of 2, the current Michigan where they jump to 2.5, Minnesota, which uses an exponent of 3. I'm not sure. And then the next one, I guess, is showing an exponent of 1.75, like just various alternative methods that we could use. And then you end with Oregon, that OR is Oregon.
Right. And the work group that wrote that really thorough report recommended Minnesota, which has an exponent of 3. And you can see that the higher the exponent, the higher the order amount. And I think the 3 and people in Minnesota says it does bring it a little higher than they expected. They debated whether to use the 2 or the 3. And Michigan's now using 2.5. Michigan started with 2, they went to 3, then they came back to 2.5. And they're also thinking maybe that 2.5 is too high. And I know that the that report recommended Minnesota, but I think giving the experiences of Michigan and Minnesota right now, if Georgia were to go further with that Michigan, Minnesota approach, I would probably recommend a lower exponent, like 2. And if you look at, when you look at Oregon and that Michigan, Minnesota exponent of 1.75, you can see it's pretty darn close in most of those cases. So, if we have the Oregon formula in another memo. And so what the point is that you can achieve the Oregon results with that Michigan, Minnesota amount formula as well. So it's an option. So, from what I hear from the committee, I would probably be steering you all to, I know the work group or the one that wrote the report, is that the work group? I forgot the official name of it. I would probably be steering you to either Minnesota for the reasons that that report states, and bring that exponent down to 2, or else I would be recommending the cross credit, with a 1.6 multiplier, which is what West Virginia uses. And then I would recommend no threshold with a cross credit, but have the language that if the formula results in something higher than the sole custody, then use the sole custody amount. And that way, one of the reasons that that work group recommended the Minnesota formula is because of the cliff effect. And if you don't have a threshold, you just let the math fall where it is, then you're not going to have any cliff effect with the cross credit. So just based on what I've heard from this group, that's, so I'm going to just throw that out there and hear what you say, you know, to help you narrow down those recommendations. That would be.
I think that's great that we're starting to narrow it down. So let's go through that a little bit slower. So the Minnesota, but instead of E equals 3, you would recommend E equals 2. And the reason
Right.
for that is what?
Michigan and both Michigan and Minnesota are not fond of having the higher exponent.
Because
You know, they think it doesn't reduce the order amount as enough for the to recognize the paying parents' expenses, direct expenses on the child. And if you look at it, that 3 is the highest of all of them.
all right. They're not happy with the result because it doesn't reduce it enough.
Right.
Okay. And
And I will say that
Michigan
statewide.
changed from 2.0 to 2.5 because they thought it reduced it too much.
They went from 2 to 3, and then they went back to 2.5.
Okay.
So what they did was they thought that the 2 was inadequate. So then they went to 3, and then they had some data come in that was presented in a unique way that said, when you use 3, you're not even covering the food costs of the child per day for when the child's in the home of the paying parent. So that's why they took it down to 2.5, and they're still not quite happy with it. We're working with Michigan right now. I don't think they could solve their problem with an exponent issue. They think that the problem with the exponent formula is that it's a curve. So when you're on the beginning of the curve or the end of the curve, and the curve is based on the time, that's when you're going to get the biggest adjustments. So and then it's income that's driving the difference. So when you have little time and there's a low income teen parent with a higher income other parent that has more time, Michigan doesn't feel like that exponent formula adjusts enough. They think that they need to tweak it on that end, that there needs to be a bigger adjustment. And Michigan's very concerned about making sure that low income parents, paying parents, that it doesn't provide any disincentive to have time sharing there, though they also recognize that there's a lot of other issues going there, and they might not, you know, it's not the only factor that causes time sharing. And then Michigan's concerned at the other end when they get to almost equal time sharing for those ones where, and this is a more common case, is that the paying parent actually has a lot more income. I just ran some data from Oregon. I didn't have Michigan data, but that was close to half of the cases with the parenting time adjustment where the paying parent has at least 120% more income. So, and they think that the paying parent might be getting too much of an adjustment there. So that's, Michigan wants to fix it through their exponent, but I don't think they can. You know, I just don't think that the exponent is always going to do that just because it's a curve. So, but then you look at the mathematical result, I'm just looking at an equal time 153, that case 4, that's 153 overnights, and equal time would be 182.5. That's a case where you have disparate income, that the dad's income in that case isn't quite twice as much as the mom's. But you look at the results and, they're pretty much all similar, within $100 or $200 there.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I'm looking at case scenario number 7, which is mom's gross income is $26.15 a month, dad's is $34.64. There's one child. Dad's parenting time is approximately 100 nights per year. I think we see that scenario a lot. And the difference then between the cross credit at 160% and the 2.0 is the 160%. It goes from what currently would be 567 down to 471, and the 2.0 is 443. So not even $30. What is that? $28 difference between those two.
Mhm.
The exponent of 2 and the cross credit of 160%. And so your recommendation is one of those two, but you were saying if we use the cross credit at 160%, no threshold, and then what did you say after no threshold?
That you would also have a clause that says is that the sole custody order is less than, because mathematically, because you've increased the obligation by 60%, there's going to be some situations like, there is a case example in here. There's going to be some situations where she has really tiny a little bit of income and he's got lots of income, and there's a little bit of time sharing, like 25% or 30%, that just because of that obligation being increased by 160%, it's going to show up as more. So then you would just say, use a sole custody order. And what that does is protects the low income household. So there's sufficient income in that household so that they still have expenses. It's not like, the problem is that it's not all as a dollar for dollar transfer, just because in that scenario, which is the dad, he's picking up some meals for the kid, mom's still got, she's lower income, she still has the bedroom and electricity. So even though it would be ideal to give dad an adjustment for the food, it's just, it takes money away from the mom in that extreme income scenario for housing for the child.
So you said if the sole custody order, which is what you're calling what we're using now, is less than the cross credit at 160%, then you would use the sole custody order.
Right, and there is a case scenario in here. I gotta find it, that happens. Let's see. It's case 9.
Yeah, they're actually the same, aren't they?
Yeah, because the cross credit is not less than the sole, what I call the sole calculation, or what you're using now. So if I was to plug in the formulas for there, it would be more than 567.
Okay.
And you can see there that, it doesn't look like a big income disparity, but it really is. I mean, mom's only got $26.15 and dad's income is almost, not quite, but it's about 30-40% more than. So in that situation, you know, I mean, it's just kind of tough, mom's gross income is 2615 and she's getting 567 or what the order is. And you want to give dad some credit, and he has 50 overnights per year, so he doesn't have a lot of overnights. It's just a tough situation, but that's the purpose of that.
When you say no threshold, you mean, it starts from day one.
This is a good example because he's only got 50 overnights, and mathematically he's not getting any adjustment, just because we did that whole thing with the soul. But you can see that if you went to old Michigan, he would get about $24 a month of an adjustment. And if you went to Minnesota, he would get $5 a month adjustment. So that's a wonderful example of a key difference between the cross credit and the Michigan, Minnesota approach.
So if we say no threshold, which is what you would recommend if we were going to do the cross credit, then we need to also say that if sole custody order, or ever how we would word it, is less, then you would choose that. So then that really requires you to just compare the two and then make that decision.
Exactly.
We're gonna have two calculators anyway if we do the cross credit, because we have the first one and then we apply the multiplier, right?
I think, yeah, and I think you're pinning down the some of the nuances that are pluses and minuses, because you definitely don't want to do the cross credit with a threshold. That was a major criticism of the work group's report of the cross credit. I mean, that would be my recommendation. Somebody could, I'm just throwing that out there. So, but you're right, it does necessitate doing the calculation twice.
And then if you do what you're calling the work group recommended, which was the Minnesota, and we use the 2 instead of the 3, then that's preferential to the cross credit because you don't have the 2 different worksheets or formulas, if you will, correct?
Correct. You don't have the 2 different worksheets. That case 9 is going to get a little bit of adjustment. I think the cross credit is easier to explain because you can see mathematically, you have the steps in the worksheet and people can see exactly how much the credit is and how it's being calculated. So that's another strength of the cross credit that it has over the Minnesota, Michigan formula.
Do you
And I don't know if
do you
people
like
are
them equally? Do you like one better than the other? Do you?
What's best for Georgia?
Yeah, what is best for Georgia? And I mean, I think you and I, Judge Williford and I have been talking, and I'm sitting in my academic tower. I think it'd be great if we could hear from others. I mean, now that we've pinned down some of the weaknesses and the strengths of these 2 methods.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of our subcommittee members on here, so
Ms. Scott was able to join us, so that brings us to 4 total subcommittee.
not to say that the other folks might not have something to say. I don't want you to think, but they may also be very lost and say, what the heck are these people talking about? Which I would not be surprised. So, Christina, do you have anything to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Good to see everybody. Sorry I was late. So I'm probably in the minority, but I really like the Oregon the best if I had to go with something. But I think second to that would be the Minnesota formula with the 2 instead of the 3. And I guess what I was trying to figure out, and the reason I say Minnesota is because I'm kind of concerned about having, you know, 2 worksheets or having to do the 2 formulas. I think it might be kind of cumbersome. The Minnesota one with the exponent, if we went with the 2 instead of a 3, are you saying, Dr. Fenor, that it kind of falls between, on your scenarios, it kind of falls between those 2 now? Like we were going to say the one between the 1.75 and the 3, is it kind of between those 2 in your mind, like the number? Or is that, or would it just depend on the scenario? Because I know they're all pretty different.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think you must have came in before I explained it. Was that Michigan, it started with 2.
Mhm.
They thought that it was too little, so they went to 3. And then they had some criticism that that wasn't even enough to cover the food costs, so they brought it down to 2.5. And now they think that it's maybe too high, but they also realize that where they want to tweak it is on the ends, like at the very low time sharing and when there's disparate income. And that's just, I think it's a problem inherent in the formula. I don't think they can fix it in the exponent. I like the 2 exponent. I think mathematically it yields the most reasonable results when you compare it to like the cross credit in Indiana is another one that I use as a benchmark, and Indiana isn't here. And the only reason I put the 1.75 in there is mathematically it almost matches Oregon. To show it that I think the Minnesota Michigan formula, if you look at it mathematically, it's very similar to the cross credit. And I will say that if there's enough people that like Oregon, you know, I'm fine with you going with it. I think Oregon loves it. Oregon is a unique state. They have a very active administrative process, and it works well with Oregon. Oregon, as you know, they have that time parenting plan template on their website and everything. They do a lot to make it happen. Oregon's very happy with that formula. They also think, though, that in those very extreme cases, there's a couple people that I've talked to that says it, is when there's a really high income paying parent and a low income, we'll use custodial parent, and they have really disparate income at that almost equal custody. They're not totally happy with that, but that's anytime you use a curve function like Michigan, Minnesota, Oregon, you're going to have that outcome. Colorado just, their commission is recommending the Oregon formula. This is the second time around. And Colorado right now uses a 1.5 cross credit multiplier with a 25% threshold. And it's that time sharing threshold that's just not good. And if you just use that whole thing that Judge Williford, she did a better job articulating it, is that if you use a cross credit with a multiplier, and then if it yields more than what that sole custody or your existing guidelines is, you use that amount, you don't even have to do a time sharing multiply. I mean, say it's got to be 25, 30% time sharing. Like if you had, and where it would work, where it would kick in, like if you have a cross credit of one with a 1.6, let's say that dad's income is 2,000 and mom's income is 4,000. I bet there would be an adjustment using the cross credit, even with that 1.6 multiplier, because the paying parent has less income. So you don't have to use that threshold, that time sharing threshold. And so it just, and that's the big criticism of the cross credit, is meeting that time sharing threshold. And then there's a cliff effect. But if you just eliminate it and just let it apply wherever it will, and it's always going to apply at a different point, just depending on the incomes of the parents. If the paying parent's income is much lower than the receiving parent's income, then it's going to kick in an earlier time sharing, you know, because the parent that has more income and more time she, I'm just gonna use she, I don't like to use gender, but just to make the language a little clearer. She's gonna be able to afford it, you know, to offset some of it. But in those cases where he's got a lot more income, then it's gonna take a larger amount of time before that cross credit kicks in. If his income is like, say, triple hers, you know, it might be closer to equal custody. Whereas when you use the Oregon or the Minnesota, Michigan formula, it's not going to be as, it's going to kick in any place. It's not going to depend on their income ratios. And that's a major thing, you know, I mean, that's something to say yeah or no, you know, from the ground, what you think would work for Georgia.
So if you did the, like in scenario 4 that we were talking about earlier on the case scenarios, so if you did the Minnesota with the exponent of 2, where would it kind of fall? I guess I'm trying to get an idea number wise, where would it be? Somewhere between the cross credit with the 1.5 and the Minnesota 3?
Well,
It would
it would be 804, right?
Yeah, it'd be 804.
Oh, okay, so it would be the old Michigan.
That's
Or
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That got an exponent of 2 in the old Michigan.
Okay, so it's the same essentially, the Minnesota, if you did that. Okay, got it.
The Minnesota with 2 is the old Michigan, right, Jane?
Correct. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you for clarifying. Okay, gotcha. All righty.
Maybe she's just calling it the Minnesota with 2 because the work group wanted Minnesota.
Right, I think so. Okay. Yeah, I personally think that would.
Christina, tell me why you prefer the Oregon.
Well, I like the way that they set up with the number of nights. They have it pretty clearly defined about, you know, counting the nights. I think the formula counts the nights for the parties as part of their worksheet.
You're talking about their parenting time calculator?
Yes. And the reason I say that is because from a mediation standpoint, people like to do that anyway. And when we're looking at these cases, or when the parties are looking at the cases, because, you know, of course, right now, Georgia doesn't have a standard. The old way, or the way that people still do it, is if they're going to give some type of, you know, the deviation, they're going to count the nights. And I know we don't really know, we haven't defined what the night is, and that's a whole nother scenario. But I guess for me, it falls in line with what a lot of, you know, practitioners and even, you know, lay people, the parties kind of think about. And if it's already kind of built on that, you know, that perspective, it may, you know, be an easier transition.
But didn't the study group recommend that regardless of which one of these we went with, that we have a parenting time calculator?
Yes.
So
Yeah,
we can have
we will.
we don't have to use Oregon's formula to have a parenting time calculator. We can have a parenting time calculator regardless of which formula we use for the parenting time adjustment.
Okay.
And I looked at the Oregon parenting time calculator because I wanted to kind of make sense of what Jane was saying about the 5th weekend. And it was easier to understand because there wasn't a 5th weekend choice. It was, you know, 1st and 3rd or 2nd and 4th or alternating or whatever, but there was, you know, and it made it clear that it's kind of hard to do these sort of unknown, you know, random things. So I'm not sure how that would work for all the folks that do the 1st, 3rd, and alternating 5th, except maybe if you went to a parenting time calculator and that wasn't an option, that moving forward, people wouldn't do the alternating 5ths. I don't know, but the study group was opposed to, we talked about this last time, any sort of standard parenting time, which I agree. And I wonder if the calculator doesn't make it easier to fall into that trap, maybe. And I hate to call it a trap, but, you know, you're like, okay, well, these are my choices. I can either do 1st and 3rd or 2nd and 4th or alternating. In the summer, I can either get this many days or this many days or this many days. I mean, if you look at Oregon's parenting time calculator, you could see how people would almost feel like, all right, to do this calculator, we need to pick one of these for, and it might become a new standard, if you will. But I think we also talked about how in reality, as a mediator, I know as a judge and someone who practiced in family law for many, many years, that most judges, most practitioners, most circuits do have their idea of what, folks do generally and what works and what doesn't work, whether you call it standard or not. You do start to see a lot of the same sort of parenting plans, used over and over again, whether or not they agree to, joint physical custody or mom's primary or dad's primary. You start to see some very similar parenting plans used repeatedly. And I think there is a way. I didn't play with it very much, but there's certainly a way to go in that Oregon parenting calculator and make some adjustments, right?
Right. I mean, I think what you're all saying is really good. I mean, I think Christina's point, and Christina, please clarify me, is that you like the Oregon definition of overnights, which I would agree, which is different than the formula, but it's very clean cut, and it deals with those odd schedules, and it doesn't count every, it gives some option to count, if they have an odd schedule, a work schedule. I'll just say that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, though.
Yeah, from what I remember, it's been a while since I looked at it, but yes, it seemed easier to kind of understand.
Well, and can somebody remind me what that is? Oregon's definition of overnights?
Find it.
It's in an old brief. I think it was.
That was like the original one, I think.
It's in a chart somewhere, isn't it?
It might be in the last one. Let me pull it out. Sorry, I'm into report writing right now, so I am not mentally around Georgia perfectly.
Is there something to call it besides Oregon? Are we just calling it Oregon because that's what they use? And I know that sounds like a strange question, but I also want whatever we come up with to have a good chance of the legislature adopting, and we need to be mindful of that. And
because when we make the suggestion, do we have to tell them first what state it is, or do we just say whatever we
this is how we should do it, right? Right. Right.
Not
Because
necessarily.
otherwise, I can see legislators looking, is this a liberal state? Is this, and letting politics get involved in it,
Yeah, we'd have to bring up our own name, the proposal A.
Right.
Yeah, you're right.
It was in the June memo, and it's on page 12, and what it says is parenting time may be determined using a method other than overnights if the parents have an alternative parenting time schedule in which a parent has significant time periods where the minor child is in the parent's physical custody but does not stay overnight. For example, in lieu of overnights, 12 continuous hours may be counted as one day. Additional blocks of time of 4 hours up to 12 hours may be counted as half days, but not in conjunction with overnights. Regardless of this method used, blocks of time may not be used to equal more than one full day per 24 period. And I probably would describe it as a method that's kind of in between. It's not as prescriptive of Arizona, where they're counting every 3 to 5 hours as a quarter day, but it's not as loose as, Minnesota, which is just pretty much use some common sense. So I would say Oregon's the in-between. How's that for an alternative word?
Since there's a lull in the conversation for just a moment, Judge Williford, I need to tell you that Judge Palmer has a conflict today and cannot join us.
Oh, wow.
And that makes it the full 2 hours available for conversation on parenting time. So yay for us, right? He'll be with us at the next meeting. He apologizes.
Noelle, Elaine, do y'all have any questions regarding any of this? I feel like Christina and I are kind of on our own here with the discussion.
I don't know that I really have any questions at this point. I'm just thinking about, my mind always goes to what do we do with the child support calculator, making it work for us. So, and we're not at the point where we have to make those decisions.
Well, Jane has told us that she recommends, Jane, again, you correct me if I say something wrong, that we either use the cross credit at 160 with no threshold in that clause, or the Minnesota, which is really the old Michigan, because if we use the Minnesota with an exponent of 2 instead of 3, and I guess the beauty of the Minnesota or old Michigan, I mean, I guess I could say that the beauty of it is that the study group who worked so hard decided that was the best one for Georgia. And we don't want to take away from all of their hard work and opinion, because I know they put a lot of thought and work into that. But in my mind, I'm thinking, did they recommend Minnesota? Because what you're really saying is that old Michigan. So, but all right. So, but they certainly preferred that over the cross credit for multiple reasons. So if we say, okay, well, then let's narrow it down to that one, Minnesota with an E of equals 2, which is old Michigan. Then is the only other thing that we talk about. We don't talk about thresholds in that one, and we don't talk about clauses in that one, because one of the
No,
reasons,
you don't.
one of the
No,
reasons they like that one is because it avoids the cliff effect, right?
Right.
One worksheet, right? It's not 2.
Yeah, it's one. Well, you still, yeah, you could do it on one worksheet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so then if we decided to go with that as our recommendation, old Michigan or new Minnesota, but with a 2 instead of a 3, is the only other thing we need to determine is the definition of overnight. And it sounds like a recommendation would be Oregon's definition of overnight. What else would we need to decide on?
I think the other thing that you would want to decide on is to have some sort of clause about, and maybe you already have it in there, if time sharing doesn't occur as considered in the financial order.
Mm-hmm.
And just to make it clear that when it's habitual, it happens over and over again. Obviously, a parent could become ill, or, COVID, could happen. We don't, you don't want to penalize the parent because of something like that. But you do, I think it's fair. We just reviewed, we're writing Oregon's report right now, and I read a lot about their comments from the time sharing adjustment, and there weren't that many. There was maybe 5%, or less of parents made comments, but those comments that were made about the Oregon adjustment, it was about, okay, time sharing is not being exercised as it was considered in the financial order.
And then what happens?
Oregon doesn't have a provision. Kentucky does, that says that that's a reason to seek a modification, that, it's a circumstance that.
But that is the resolution, is to actually file a modification.
Right.
I had an off the record discussion with a nameless senator who is a friend who I think is a pretty powerful Georgia senator about what we were working on. And that was the first thing that popped out was, so you're saying that parents will have to go back and hire a lawyer and go back to court and seek a modification if the parenting time isn't being exercised. It was like shutting me down, you know? And so I wondered really if there are any other states that have a solution. I don't know what it would be other than actually going in and seeking a modification and a new court order.
New Jersey says in their provision, and I probably have it in one of the memos. If not, I could put my finger on it pretty quickly because I just wrote about it. New Jersey has a provision that says that there has to be like a simplified form or court process so that, and it's a form actually to do the modification. So you want to make it a little pro se friendly,
Yeah.
you know, where they wouldn't have to hire an attorney, but it's one of those things that, I don't think there's a good solution because, you know, it's just to give a time sharing adjustment. And just because that was one of the reasons I gave you the statistics on how often I read that comment in the Oregon survey. It wasn't that often.
Yeah, it's not as big a deal as people think it is. I mean, most folks exercise their parenting time, correct?
Right. Well, I would think, you know, like in Oregon, there was maybe 3,000 comments and there were maybe 20 or 30 comments that were on that. So, you know, you can do that's like 1%.
Yeah.
But it's still, I mean, it's still an issue, you know, and, you know, Georgia is a SAVES grant center. And I mean, which is concerned about getting safe access to victims of domestic violence. And, you know, and it's fair to give a time sharing adjustment. It's also fair to have a mechanism that helps parents modify it if it doesn't occur. And it was also both ways in the Oregon data that I read. It was more so for the primary custodial parent, but there was several paying fathers that said that they had more time sharing than, and they were paying the full order amount, you know. And, you know, it's one of those things that there's always a unintended consequence because that the issue with requiring a parenting time order or a parenting time plan or agree to parenting plan to before you get that financial adjustment is that you got to modify both then, you know, when it doesn't happen. So let's say that the equal custody is ordered. And then that's the way the child support order is calculated. And then the child turns 16 or 17 is just really difficult. I mean, we've all had difficult teenagers or known of them. And they say, I am not spending any more time with mom, you know, and then what happens? I mean, you know, what's fair to dad, and it could be vice versa. It could be, I'm not going over to dad's. I don't want to do it anymore. Just making sure that the courts can address that appropriately.
And
I
Jan,
see Pat Bonadono has her hand up.
I thought that once upon a time, there was a provision that if parenting time wasn't being used, that you could ask the court for a reconsideration within 90 days, but I'm not
I think
sure if I
that
can.
it's one of
find
the
it.
reasons where you can go in and seek a modification if even if it's not been 2 years,
Mhm.
if parenting time is different than what was court ordered, more or less. And that was one of the concerns that I had, and Noel addressed this and clarified it a little bit for us earlier in the year. because I had it on my list of things that maybe needed to be changed in the statute, because as I was educated on the fact that Georgia's child support is actually based on what Jane is calling sole custody, which I kind of like that because it really is what it is. You know, you
Mhm.
call it intact family, which I think is what Elaine calls it. But regardless, it assumes that one parent has the child all the time. And so I questioned once I was aware of that, because that was shocking to me, because I'm one of the many folks in the state who mistakenly thought that there was parenting time built in. But if that's true, if the child support number assumes that one parent has the child all the time, then how in the world can you go in and ask the court to penalize the non-custodial parent for not exercising their time when the child support assumes that they have the child 365 days a year? And so I question whether or not that was some oversight that, you know, was wrong in the statute. And Noelle helped me understand that I was wrong. And I can't remember how she helped me understand that. Noelle, I'll kick it to you.
I vaguely remember this, but I think I maybe called it like revocation of the deviation. Like if the deviation was granted, but then for some reason not used. And this could be because of a bad actor. It could also just be because circumstances. Maybe somebody was, maybe 50-50 joint physical custody worked for a family because they used to live closely together, in close proximity, but then somebody moved because of a job change or something. And then the deviation shouldn't be what we would call the parenting time deviation should be taken back.
So that rings a bell. So I
Revoked.
guess the way I was reading the statute, I was reading it that, and I think a lot of practitioners actually read it this way, that, all right, if you're awarded, I'll call it 100 days a year, dad, for parenting time, and you don't exercise it, then mom can come back in and ask for more child support. Because again, in my mind, I thought, well, you're getting a break on child support because there's 100 days built in. You're not exercising 100 days, so you're going to have to pay more child support now. And I guess what Noelle helped me understand is maybe that language was specifically, and I don't know if it's clear, we need to, this subcommittee needs to look at that statute more closely, but what it maybe meant, and this sort of rings a bell, Noelle, is if you got a deviation on Schedule E for parenting time, if you did, and you didn't exercise it, then yes, you could go back in and seek a modification, even though it hadn't been 2 years, because you haven't, up or down, whether you got a modification up or down on parenting time.
Yeah, subsection K addresses that very language.
Right.
Judge.
So it only applies then, Elaine, if there was in fact a parenting time deviation on Schedule E, correct?
That would be my understanding. And Pat actually worked on that when she was the staff attorney. And I think that's why she brought that subject up, because the statute does provide for that. If before the 2-year typical period for modification, these issues exist, even a greater amount of parenting time is being exercised, that would be a reason that either parent could bring an action to modify the order.
Well, the language in the statute on modification says you have to wait 2 years after a previous modification, not a previous order.
Not original order.
Okay,
Previous
good point.
modification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Pat, help me understand the parenting time deviation
mhm.
was to deviate from the set amount, the basic child support obligation, or the presumptive amount, right?
Presumptive, yes.
The presumptive amount. For parenting time, if you're exercising more or less parent, and I guess this is where I'm confused, because when I understand that it already assumes 365 days. Jane, you're shaking your head no.
The reason I
No,
will tell
it-
you, I'm sorry, the reason that we can modify upward if the parent is not exercising parenting time.
Right?
A judge who shall remain nameless insisted we put that in the statute, and so
Okay.
we did.
But wasn't it,
I guess
Pat,
that's
was-
where I was that's where I was confused. I could see adjusting, giving a parenting time deviation downward. Don't get me wrong. I could
Right.
definitely see that. It was the adjusting it upwards if you
Right.
didn't exercise the parenting time when the amount already assumes you have no parenting time. That was confusing to me. And
But
Jane,
Pat, was that, and I wanted to ask Pat a question real quick, because wasn't this whole conversation considering the fact that there was a deviation included? Am I not remembering that
Yes.
correctly? There would have been a deviation
Oh,
included,
no. He wanted,
not necessarily. Okay,
he wanted a deviation if the non-custodial parent was granted parenting time and didn't exercise it, because in
okay,
his
that's what I'm
eyes,
saying. And
they were getting that deviation because they wanted to pay less child support.
right, so there was a deviation included, and the judge wanted to be able to then, in a modification, reduce the deviation or maybe take it out, but it was there originally.
Yes.
Yes,
Well,
okay,
No, because you can go from the basic, whatever the child support worksheet says without a deviation, and I have to,
Consumptive amount.
all the terminology has left me.
Okay.
But
sorry.
and that parent was granted parenting time and they're not using it.
Even
then
though
he
they
wanted to
weren't
be able
granted a deviation to begin with.
Right. Then he wanted to be able to make them pay more child support.
Oh, see, I would have assumed if a deviation, if parenting time was being considered, there would have been a deviation associated with it. But Pat, you're saying not necessarily.
That's not what the language in the statute says, and that wasn't the request we had.
Okay,
Pat, I think
okay, I
that-
couldn't remember that detail. Thank you.
I think, Pat, that in reality, that's the way people look at that part of the
Yes.
statute. They don't care if
Yes.
there was a deviation before or not. They just think, all right, dad, and I use dad, but non-custodial parent was awarded 100 days or 50 days or 150 days, whatever it is, and they're not exercising it. So I ought to be able to go in and file a modification and modify to get more money because dad's not exercising it.
And mom is bearing all the expenses, yeah.
Right, but the presumptive amount assumes that dad has 0 time and that mom has 365 days a year. Jane, you're shaking your head no.
No,
she's had her hand
that
up for a while.
schedule, that schedule assumes the child is being raised in one household. And there's nothing about the number of days. It's impossible to make an assumption about the number of days. Clothing, we can't divide the cost of the children's clothing on a per diem amount. We can't divide housing more so than clothing on a per diem amount. So it's just the child's being raised in one household. There's two things going on that the paying parent, as he has more time, he's going to incur some expenses like food and housing. But then it's like, when are her costs reduced for the child? You know, so there can't be any assumptions. It's just that's how much it costs to raise a child in one household. There's not any assumptions about he has 0 days, 1 day, 2 day, 3 days, or whatever. If he had 1 day per year, would it really make a difference? You know, in
Well,
that
let me
term?
ask you this: in your chart of examples that you gave us, you titled them and you titled it sole custody. That sole custody number is the number that our current worksheets would be, correct?
Sole custody meaning that there isn't a deviation for time sharing.
Right, so line 13, is that what you're saying, Judge?
Well, I don't know the line numbers.
Yeah, that would be
so-
our final child support amount on line 13 of our worksheet.
Our final child support number is what you're calling sole custody.
Yeah.
And does
mhm.
sole custody not mean that one parent has the child all the time?
That's your definition. I'm talking about the math behind the schedule. The schedule is based on expenditures in intact family. There's no time sharing going on in an intact family.
But we know that it's not an intact family. The whole reason why we don't order child support.
But the
intact family.
schedule, when we're talking about the table, that's where the data comes from, is expenditures on intact family, because the income shares model presumes that the child's entitled to the same amount of expenditures that the child would have received had the parents lived together and shared financial resources. So when the economists look at the data, they're looking at intact families because those are the ones that share financial resources. We don't have data on two families living separately apart.
So what you're saying, I think we're missing each other, is with our current child support calculator, the BCSO, the basic child support obligation, the table, those numbers say this is what it costs to raise this child, 1 child, 2 children, 3 children, with parents with this income. This is what I
In an
explained to
intact-
these
In an intact household.
This is how much it costs to raise 2 children. When you're combined, it comes 15,000, whatever. And then the calculator, what it does is it divides based pro rata from those parents' income, right? And then it spits out the number. So I think what we're missing each other is that, yes, that's still the number being divided pro rata. However, someone having a day or 2 days, it's not factored in. It's just the numbers that are factored in. There's no time factored in.
Right.
Right, okay.
The expenditures for a child in an intact household is what it's based on.
Right.
Right.
Not time.
Yeah.
So that's why there's no parenting time built into the table, because it's for intact household. So now we're entertaining the parenting time starting from 1 day. Is that what we're talking about with where we are with these examples? We're talking about starting with 1 day on the cross credit and
Well,
going forward.
I think Jane said if we use the cross credit with the multiplier, then there shouldn't be a threshold, but we need that clause. But if we go with Minnesota, whether it's 2 or 2.5 or 3 or whatever, we don't have to talk about a threshold or have that clause, correct, Jane?
Correct.
And because it'll all work itself out in the calculation. And we do have to figure out what an overnight is. And Jane said a good median, if you will, between sort of, each far end would be Oregon's definition of an overnight, correct, Jane?
Correct. And Christina brought that up,
Right.
and I second it.
Right.
And not in a voting way.
Right, I understand, not in a voting way, but you agree with her that that's a
Yeah.
good compromise, right?
Mhm.
And then, Noelle, what else was on our list of things that we would have to answer in order to make a recommendation to the commission, or Elaine?
I do think those are the big ones, the formula, like how to do the
Well, once
calculation.
we figure this out, then somebody has to figure out how it goes in the formula. I don't know who does that, but certainly I don't think us, is it?
Oh, I mean, in the calculator then, but just
Yeah,
what
in the
formula,
calculator.
like what methodology, meaning the formula, the number of overnight, and whether or not we're going to have a threshold at which it starts. I think those were the big questions.
Those are certainly the biggies.
Well, and we have to be able to write the language in the statute,
Mhm.
start preparing a bill. And unfortunately, we don't have Holly with us today,
Right.
but that would be where we would have to look the statute over and figure out what's going to be impacted, what has to be changed. One of the things that comes to mind for me is right now what our statute requires for shared parenting, our 50-50, the joint physical custody, is parents may want to do the 50-50 custody, but the statute says right now in the definition, A9, that you have to look at the parent that has the higher income, higher child support obligation. Noelle, I was
Oh,
about to
look
say
at
it
you,
wrong.
Elaine.
I
Look at
know.
you.
Can't believe I
Fact
did
versus
that.
folklore.
Yes.
So it's just the
Good one,
parent with the
Elaine.
higher child support obligation becomes the non-custodial parent. Well, what we do in training is we train people to recognize that, and Jane's been mentioning this in some of the scenarios she has here, you could have a parent with 85% of the income and it's a higher income, maybe it's 10,000 a month, and the other parent with a very low income. Well, you can't necessarily just make that a 50-50 order situation where there is no child support paid, because our statute's telling you, you have to determine a non-custodial parent, the parent that owes the higher child support obligation, which means once you've declared that NCP in that worksheet, that parent may still owe child support to the other parent. And unfortunately, a lot of people out there don't seem to understand that process. And they'll think that 50-50, a lot of parents in particular, will think that 50-50 means no child support is exchanged. And that's not the intention, is my understanding of income shares, because we're still having to make sure the child is appropriately supported.
Well, of course.
So
we have to
that's one of the
explain
things we have to, we have to think about those the definitions and places like that in the statute. Are we taking that out? Are we leaving it in? Those are parts of the statute I just want to bring to our attention. We have to think about. There's a lot in the language.
So wouldn't that though go to not this subcommittee, but people like Holly and people that are writing the
Well,
statute for
the
us?
statute review subcommittee has historically always worked with the legislative council to come up with the appropriate language. So it actually would fall to this subcommittee with Holly's guidance and help. She would need to look at the statute, considering what it is we're talking about doing. If the commission approves that, then start looking at where do we have to make all these adjustments in the statute? What has to be edited?
All right. Well, does anyone else have any questions about which method works best? Which definition of parenting time works best, or overnights works best? What exponent should be used, or if you like the cross credit, which multiplier should be used? Any of those questions? Does anybody have any questions or comments that we haven't addressed to Jane or to the other members of the subcommittee?
Judge, this is Pat. I really like the language in Oregon about the parenting time as far as an overnight or being able to adjust the hours. I think that would be very helpful to folks here.
Okay. Joanna?
Yes, Judge. I think Oregon, at least part of it would be good in terms of the definition of overnight, but in some of my hypotheticals, when we were on the study committee, there are some shift parents who would only ever have evenings after school through like 9 or 10 at night, and they would never meet the 12-hour definition to get the alternate credit, and they might actually be providing dinner every night and sometime on the weekends. So I would just throw that out there, that if there's a way to not have it be set at 12 hours, if it was a definition that was like regular and recurring daytime periods, then you could do like a average 24-hour calculation, as an alternate instead of strictly a 12-hour. That's the only thing I don't love about the Oregon definition, and I may not be explaining that very well, but
I think that, and I hear what you're saying, and that's certainly something to consider, but I think that what we talked about is making sure that whatever we do, and even if it is a parenting time adjustment, that judges still have the discretion to deviate from that in unusual situations. And it sounds like that would be a perfect example of an unusual situation where the non-custodial parent really never has an overnight or 12 hours, but still has substantial time with the child because they have them every evening after school and feed them dinner or, something. Unusual situation, but really good argument for deviating. If we went with the 12 hours, but you like to tell me, I hate to put you on the spot, but tell me again what language you liked instead of 12 hours.
Well, I liked having two alternatives. One would be total number of overnights, because I think that's really easy for pro se parties, and that will be the majority of people who I'm dealing with. Actually, that's the only people I deal with is pro se parties. So they'll be able to calculate that pretty easily. And then the alternative language would be in circumstances where a parent has shorter but regular and recurring daytime periods with the child, the total hours of parenting time per year divided by 24 hours. So that's a little complicated, but it does allow people, if they wanted to come up with an alternate. And when I ran some hypotheticals, if we were worried about parents trying to lobby for one over the other and litigate about that, it really made very little difference in most of the common visitation scenarios. It would like made a difference of a day or something when I ran the numbers, and I could explain that in better detail another time, but I felt comfortable that it wasn't going to be a reason to litigate which option they went with. You know, if there were two options, it would only be used if parents really didn't have another alternative that was easy.
Well, you said your first alternative was total number of overnights, and what would the definition of overnight be?
I think there wasn't a definition. It's just if it's overnight. So it was days.
The common sense definition of overnight.
Well, right. It would be, yeah, literally overnight. And I think several states have used that. And so it would actually be defining days as the total number of overnights, or in the alternative, this other hourly calculation.
Well, and I want to throw I understand where Johanna's coming from with this. Our economy has changed a lot over the last few years, especially when you think about post-pandemic or even during that time period, the gig economy. And I know that DCSS is having a lot of, they're connecting a lot with individuals who are part of that gig economy. And they're doing work where they're driving for Uber. You know, their hours are sporadic. Their hours are also, maybe this week they're driving at night, next week they're driving during the day. So people that are in those types of jobs are going to have difficulty with literal overnights. So we may, unfortunately, even though deviation might be a way to go, we may see that become too much of normal. And it may make it difficult for parties and the judge to try to figure out, you know, what is this person's schedule. And so I think we should keep an open mind for looking at some sort of alternative that would consider those individuals who are working shift work. Police officers, that's another one that comes to mind, is working shift work. You know, because they're going to have 3 around the clock schedules, and sometimes they work 30 days on this schedule. The next month it's 30 day, you know, the next month it's 30 days on a different schedule, and so forth. They rotate every month.
All right.
So yeah.
I'm trying to look at Johanna's comment where she typed it. B, in circumstances where a parent has shorter but regular and recurring daytime periods with a child, the total hours of parenting time per year divided by 24 hours, including in the calculation any hours spent overnight if applicable. So you're literally saying, I'm going to count the number of hours I have with my child in 365 days and divide that by 12.
By 24.
Excuse me, by 24. Why are we dividing it by 24?
To get the number of days.
24-hour day.
Right. All right.
Yeah. So the idea is that
in circumstances where a parent has shorter but recurring and regular daytime periods with a child, the total hours of parenting time per year divided by 24 hours gives you the number of days. I got you.
It sounds complicated, but there are some people we already do that for when we're trying to calculate parenting time for the child support addendum, because they only have maybe 10 hours a week or 12 hours a week. I mean, it really doesn't matter for the parenting time deviation at this point, because you know, we haven't regularly used parenting time deviation unless there was a substantial amount of parenting time,
No,
but
I understand what you're saying. It
Yeah.
sounds complicated, but it's really not. If they say I have my child 12 hours a week total,
Right.
and multiply it times 52.
exactly.
And maybe you take out a few weeks for Christmas or whatever. I
Right.
mean, you just do the math. You're not sitting there going, all right, on February the 12th, I had this many days and you're just, but,
And I think it would accomplish what Elaine is saying, maybe, you know, for the folks who don't have a classic overnight.
mhm. Yeah, it would, certainly. But I'm concerned about calling anything a classic overnight
Sure.
Well,
because,
that's my concern too. Does it
yeah,
exist any longer?
there are words that we assume under, statute interpretation have the common meaning of the word or whatever, but what is an overnight? I mean, honestly, that's a big question, right? If they, I don't know.
What do you do with school time in that definition?
School
Did I miss
time,
it?
sorry, Dr. Venor, I mean, school time, as far as I understand it, we don't exempt school time. So, I mean, when I calculate parenting time for a parent, I'm looking, you know, if the dad drops the child off Monday morning at 7 o'clock and then, you know, that's the end of his parenting time, then mom is basically responsible from that point on through the day. And I count the rest of that day as her time if she's got the kids. So, but I know that probably attorneys differ. So the judge could speak better to that for sure.
Well, it's a very good question, and I hate to admit that I think about this stuff so much that I woke up at 6 o'clock this morning thinking about it and thinking about school time and thinking about sleeping time and thought, is it even fair to include that? But then I thought to myself, if your child's up vomiting all night and you're up with this child and you're changing out the bed sheets and and if your child is sick at school, and who are they going to call and who's got to go get them and who's got to make the arrangements and, so you can't really, you do sort of have to figure out, and obviously in a parenting plan, we want to know who legally on paper has custody of this child during this time, right? And so whoever that is, that's their parenting time. So you should be, I tell folks all the time, if law enforcement got involved in this, because I get these parenting plans, I've got one sitting right here next to me that a lawyer, a very experienced lawyer just sent me. And every paragraph in the parenting plan, it says, as agreed to by the parties, summer, as agreed to by the parties, vacation, as agreed to by the parties. I'm going to reject that because I explain to people, law enforcement ought to be able to pick up that parenting plan. And if it is 3:27 p.m. on July 21st of 2023, they ought to know, they ought to be able to go to that parenting plan. It ought to be detailed enough that they could say, all right, legally, this child is in the custody of this person right now. Okay. And that applies whether it's school, whether it's overnight, whatever it is. And so that time, then, if we were looking at a parenting time calculator for child support purposes, it should be the same thing. We ought to be able to know exactly who the child is in the custody of for those hours, and that's how you would calculate the hours. Now, I was a mediator too. I was an attorney for many years, and they do make that argument. Well, I have the child more than he does because the child's in school, the child's sleeping. I'm the one that does the homework, the feeding, the whatever, but we really can't look at it like that. And I understand the argument, but we really can't look at it like that because that child has to be, somebody's responsible for that child. And it's more expensive to take care of children who are awake and out of school. But, I don't know that we can get, I can't imagine we can get that detailed. Dr. Venor, are there states that do take out school time or sleeping time or anything like that from the consideration?
No, not that I recall at the top of my head. But I know I've seen it as a comment somewhere and I'm not registering where.
No, I've heard the comments myself.
I think
Yes,
that's
there is a state, I've read at least one of the states that we've looked at did exempt, they just took out the time that the children were in school. And then they did the ratios after they had taken out the school time. And I just can't remember which state it was. But
I think the assumption for most people now, at least from what I see, is, the parent receiving, once you receive that child, then you're in charge of them at that point. So if the non-custodial parenting time ends, that's the end of their time, the other parent starts. And if they're in school, they're still sort of, in charge, or that's their time.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. I think some folks argue that once the school receives them,
Right, yeah, I've heard
we
it.
no longer have them, but I understand what you meant. When the parent who's receiving
Mhm.
is when their parenting time begins.
Noelle has her hand up.
Noelle?
Yeah, and I don't want to jump to a different topic before, we've let everybody exhaust their thoughts on how to calculate parenting time, like the amount of parenting time. But you asked earlier, all the outstanding issues, and one came to mind, just us being very clear about whether we're moving to an adjustment, as we use that term in Georgia, or, moving from a deviation to adjustment, and to make sure that I understand and everybody understands that for me, the parenting time, I'm going to call it in this case adjustment, that Dr. Bernard has been suggesting to us, it's only modifying the BCSO amount, so that where it would happen in the calculation would be before we add additional expenses for childcare and health insurance.
Right.
That everything, everywhere after the BCSO amount, we're giving credit to the parent who has expenses, who bears part of that BCSO amount, but isn't currently getting any credit for that. Downstream from there, we make people put in the actual expense, and then we give credit to the parent actually paying that expense. We don't do that at all for the BCSO. And so that's how I think of this entire process. Sorry, I'm sort of going back and zooming out on this entire process, but I see the parenting time deviation or adjustment as rectifying the fact that at the moment, the custodial parent currently gets all of the BCSO amount.
So the Minnesota, let's say we're using 2 and not 3, would modify the BCSO amount, right? And we don't have to worry about a threshold on that one. And we don't have to do 2 worksheets, and we don't have to say if this, then this, because you don't have 2 worksheets. And we find a definition for overnight, which is maybe something like Oregon with some alternatives for people who, need them. Like Johanna's suggestion, something similar to that. And we call it a parenting time adjustment. That's what Minnesota does, right? It's a parenting time adjustment, right, Jane?
I think so. I don't have the language in my head.
But we still have an adjustment, not a deviation.
Oh, okay.
Still have the discretion as judges to deviate from the adjusted amount.
So we'd have to fix that on the worksheet, Judge, to make it an adjustment, plus still allow on Schedule E for a deviation if the judge so desires.
Right. C would be the adjustment, but we would still have the ability to do a deviation on E.
And that's language, how we state that in the statute. Because whatever's in the statute is how we build the calculator. Calculator is only built from the statute.
And we could have a parenting time calculator. Does Minnesota have a parenting time calculator, or would, I know Oregon has that option, but you have the parenting time calculator just to help figure out what the parenting time actually is?
Minnesota, I don't know of them having an aggressive, I would say the states you want to look at are Indiana, Oregon, Missouri has some stuff, even Alabama has some stuff on constructing that parenting time plan.
But there's
that
no
are-
reason why we couldn't have a parenting time calculator and still use the Minnesota formula with an exponent of 2, correct?
Right. Mhm.
Yes, we can do that.
In fact, it would be helpful, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, we need to automate every bit of this that we can.
Yeah. You go on Oregon's website, it's just click here for parenting time calculator, click here for this, click here for that. Very, very useful. Well, it's unfortunate that we only have a few members of the subcommittee on here, and obviously anything that we suggest has to go before the full commission. But we do have another meeting scheduled. Does anyone else have any more questions or discussion for Jane? Before
I
we
see
move on?
Pat has her hand up, and then I have one thing for Jane after Pat.
All right, Pat.
Okay, this is just for the subcommittee in general. I thought the whole point of discussing a parenting time adjustment was to do away with the deviation. That we wouldn't need the deviation in.
Well, I
But don't
thought
we,
that we
judicial
talked,
discretion?
yeah, I thought we talked about making sure that there was still judicial discretion, and you're not going to have judicial discretion with the deviation.
Okay,
Yeah, I think it's the formula, that there always has to be a deviation, but right now, yeah.
Yeah,
I-
there
I
always
know.
has to be judicial discretion because there's always going to be some scenario that falls outside of the norm.
okay, I misunderstood that. Thank you.
But I think that, right now, judges would need to be deviating a whole lot to really take into consideration parenting time moving forward. And if we adjust it, then it seems like judges would not be deviating very often, because they would only be deviating where, for some reason, when you put the parenting time in and did the adjustment, it wasn't fair and equitable and in the best interest of the child and all those things that we need to consider.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Judge Wilfred, do you think it needs to still be called, so we would have in the process, so still be called the parenting time deviation, or just let it be a non-specific deviation with an explanation? I'm
I was gonna
thinking,
say, I think if we're not careful, people will be very confused about,
Yeah,
yeah.
because I see this as changing the process. We're adding a component of the process of calculating child support. That's what I mean by an adjustment. We
Yeah,
have the gross
Yeah,
income
on
of
the
the
worksheet.
parties. Yeah, on the worksheet, we have the gross income of the parties. We adjust it by one or all three of 3 things. I could go into what they are, but they're
Yeah.
sometimes rarely used. That's what we call Schedule B.
yeah,
Then we jump to D. So that gives us, after A and B, we get the BCSO amount. We jump to D, add the additional expenses. But there we have the numbers. We have the numbers of who's paying what exactly.
yeah.
For the BCSO amount, we don't know who's paying what of that aggregate amount, and that's the problem. That's for why I've always seen this as, I don't even want to say it because I upset the Parenting Time Study Committee years ago at this point, when I said, well, this would be like adding Schedule C. And everybody's like,
oh, yeah, we're gonna have to have
No, no,
something
no, no.
equivalent.
No, C,
Yeah.
yeah, C would be the
Yeah,
adjustment.
we have to have a Schedule
C would
C.
be
There's no
the
way around it.
adjustment. Yeah,
Yes, C
that's
would
how
be the
I
adjustment.
see it. And I just want to know is,
So I think you're right. I think that in E, we could, and we need to obviously flesh this out further, but E, you could just do a specific deviation, because we call it a parenting time deviation when we already have a Schedule C parenting time adjustment. That's going to be very confusing.
right.
But in our statute, when we explain about specific or non-specific is what I'm trying to say, deviations, then we might need to have, as an example, a parenting time deviation where the parenting time adjustment is not, you know, X,
Appropriate
Y,
for
and Z.
some
Yes,
reason.
yes,
Okay, okay.
yes. So that we can
Yeah.
explain that that would be one of the reasons why you would use the non-specific deviation. But
And
I
there would,
do
you'd
think
still
it-
have to do findings of fact for that as well.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
So we're adding to the process of calculating child support by throwing in accounting for parenting time. And then we're just gonna still have we're not gonna have a parenting time deviation any longer, but if the judge felt like, for whatever reason, the presumptive amount of child support is inappropriate for the best interest of the child, then they can still deviate and change it and give their findings of fact. And it may be because of parenting time, is what we're saying.
Right.
Yes.
So in addition to so I'm assuming the BCSO, that chart will still be there, that will be there. So then we will also have a parenting time calculator or a chart that sort of in the background that is talking about what we were saying now. And that's going to be the adjustment. It's going to, that, I guess, chart will factor into these adjustments based on the income.
So you put the days in the parenting time calculator, or the schedule, I should say, in the parenting time calculator. And then it would calculate what the actual parenting time is.
For you.
And
What-
then that parenting time would determine what the adjustment would be.
Right. I kind of envision this as it's replacing Schedule C. We can call it parenting time calculator. You plug in the information, the parents or the attorneys, they plug in the information and it does all the work in the calculator, and it then spills over back to the worksheet like every other schedule does, and feeds in on one line the information about the parenting time under whichever parent's column, and then it subtracts it and gives you a new balance. So we're going to end up with probably a line 15 as our final child support amount, maybe a 16, something like that. Depends on how we work it, depends on how many subtotals we have to have and so forth. But it's going to extend, the length of the worksheet. That's not horrible.
Right.
But it would all be on that, what was Schedule C, and we could just call it so we avoid, like Noelle said, when we talked about Schedule C, everybody's like, nah, so, but we could call it parenting time calculator.
Okay.
Something like that to keep from calling it that Schedule C, which never existed, because
it
it
never-
never,
it was
it
reserved
never
from day
became part of the
one.
calculator from the very
Right.
beginning. It got bumped out, years ago. But I think we could make that work, and we'll just have to figure out, and we can use other states' examples, take a look at what they do. And as long as what our language says, statutory language says, then we build ours based on what the statutory language requires.
All
Right,
right, does anybody else have any questions or comments?
I
Elaine?
do. Sorry, but Noelle reminded me of this. When we're looking back at the action items we had for this entire work activity on parenting time, one of them comes to mind, and this is really for Jane, and this may be a non-issue, but I want to clarify it in my own mind. We talked earlier about joint legal custody where parents are doing 50-50. And we look at that today as a little bit separate process from parenting time. You still use a parenting time deviation, but there are a lot of parents who in Georgia, they want to zero the child support. And right now what the statute says, and I brought this up earlier, was that the parent with the higher child support obligation is designated the non-custodial parent, and there could still be child support owed depending on that parent's income. If there's, if they're really 50-50 and their income are very, very close, maybe there's no money exchanged, but you could have, an extreme difference in their incomes, and maybe non-custodial still needs to pay child support. So when you're thinking about the 50-50, is what we're doing for parenting time going to already address that? And maybe there is no 50-50 any longer? I mean, I'm just not really sure, because a lot of the intention is to zero the child support. And yet that sometimes should not be the case, but there are instances where the parents are very close in income and, they're going to make that decision that they're going to zero it. We also have split parenting, but I think that one works okay, but we may need to keep that on the back burner as well. But the 50-50 concerns me as to whether or not we're addressing it already, or do we need to look at that separately?
No, the formula, any of the formulas that you are considering would zero that out if there was equal income, but they wouldn't zero it out if there was non-equal income, which is your
Okay.
desirable outcome.
Yeah, that solves that problem. Good.
Yeah, if
Okay.
it was equal income and 50-50, it would zero it out. If not, it would say who owed who what. Correct, Jane?
Right.
Correct.
And you would still be declaring a non-custodial parent, sometime earlier in the calculation, perhaps, but that would be one of the things we need to look at is whether or not we need definition A9. Do we still need to declare for the purpose of 50-50 a non-custodial parent? Because
Mathematically, you don't
Okay.
need to, though I hate that term non-custodial parent, but I don't get to decide.
Well, since we're still there until if we change anything or not,
Yeah.
but still, that's one of the things we have to consider in changing language in the statute is that if we are not going to have to make a declaration of the obligor, NCP, paying parent, whatever, then even if they're equal incomes, if they're going to go to zero, but what you're saying is if there is a parent with a higher income than the other, then based on the income, there may still be a requirement that that parent pay child support, and that would just work itself out in the calculation.
Yeah, assuming there's no add-ons. I mean, you could have some weird situation where the lower income parent has a crazy add-on for childcare, like $1,000 a month, then.
Right.
I mean, you
And
have
what would that do then? Because that parent would have a lower income. You would
Oh,
still.
wait a minute, that's a bad example. I meant to say the
Okay.
opposite. The higher income parent has the add-on expense, but you can
Okay.
do that. I mean,
Okay.
Minnesota deals with it, the cross credit deals with it. So you just want to look at those if you went with Minnesota, I think their language is really good. If you went with the cross credit, I have to think a minute for what state would be a good example, but you can deal with it and you don't have to designate. You don't have to have two different formulas.
Okay. But in that situation, you could have two parents who are deciding we're going to do a 50-50 here, but depending on how those expenses fall out, such as the additional expense of work-related childcare, which is always high, that may put the final result of the calculation may end up that one parent has to pay the other. And neither one of them are, I don't know, you could say, but neither one's an NCP, neither one's a CP, because they're going to be sharing that child 50-50 anyway. They're just parents. So, okay, that helps. Okay, thank you.
Christina, did you have your hand up?
No, I was just thinking about what Elaine was saying about or what Dr. Venora was saying about again, we were talking about the numbers, if it's joint and the incomes are similar, which we see that sometimes. I've actually seen it probably about 3 or 4 times in my career, where then if it's true, then if it's a zero, we still now have the issue of who would be custodial and non-custodial. I think in my mind, I was just sort of thinking about that, because that'll be another point of somewhere else for them to argue about.
Yeah.
It is what it is. That's a separate thing, because even the federal law designates in terms of, who gets the tax credit, one would have to be custodial. So then that would be something of some fervent discussion, I'm sure, in mediation on that. So.
I was
I
looking,
can't even
Johanna,
imagine.
at the link that you sent us of the Minnesota Child Support Parenting Time calendar tool.
Oh, they do have one. Cool. Good find.
So,
What was that, Judge Wilson?
if you'll look at the link in the chat, Johanna put a link to Minnesota's Child Support Parenting Time calendar tool. And the Minnesota Department of Human Services Child Support Division created this tool to help parents, attorneys, and child support professionals count the number of court-ordered overnights each parent has for their children when parents don't live together. Calculates an average number of overnights over a 2-year period and may include a standard schedule, holidays, other overnights, and overnight equivalents as determined by court order. So you can check out that calculator and you need to know that each parent's gross monthly income from all sources, how many legal children each parent has, do not count the children who the parent has a court order to pay child support, any other child support orders for either parent, any spousal maintenance orders for either parent, the amount of benefits from Social Security, goes on about that, the monthly cost for both medical and dental coverage, the amount of child care cost, the percentage or amount of parenting time awarded in a court order. If the parent is incarcerated, the ability to pay the minimum basic support calculation does not apply, and the amount of parenting time per child per parent. And then it says proceed to the calculator for the guidelines effective before January 1st, 2023, and then effective after January 1st, 2023. So obviously, that change took place recently. But y'all may just want to check that out further for examples of how we might move forward if we went with that method. All right, well, it's 3:51. Does anyone have any other questions for Dr. Venor? If not, I'll move forward with LaTonna on an update.
Johanna has her hand up.
All right, Johanna.
Sorry, Judge. The only thing I would just say for y'all to think about and decide on, if this hasn't come up, and I apologize for not being able to get into the meeting earlier, is I believe Minnesota, and I don't know if the other one that you're looking at does have the ability for a parent who has more time to actually be ordered to pay child support. And I feel like some states draw the line where they say that's not possible. I know Georgia's case law says that that's possible, but most people don't go there. So that would just be something to be aware of, when you're thinking about, if that is a line that needs to be drawn or not. I'm just throwing that out there. And then the other issue that I don't know if you discussed before I got on.
Wait, before you go on to the other issue, I'm confused because you're saying if they have more than what they were, if they exercise more than what they were ordered?
No, I'm sorry. If you have two parents and the greater time parent has substantially more income than the lesser time parent.
Okay.
The formula can allow the court to order the greater time parent to pay child support to the lesser time parent. And that doesn't always resonate well with some people.
Well,
So
there's a case on point in Georgia where that actually happened, and it was everybody's mind was blown.
right.
Okay.
So I mean, it's already permissible in Georgia, but it's just not. It doesn't happen very often. And I honestly don't know how often it would really happen using a formula like Minnesota or another cross credit. And that may be something that Dr. Venor would be able to speak to more, but some states draw the line where, they define that only the parent who has lesser time can be ordered to pay, or if I recall correctly, but that just popped into my mind. So.
Just to be absolutely clear about the cross credit in the Minnesota formula allow for flipping. That they allow for the situation where a higher earner with higher time, more time, can be the obligated parent.
Okay. That answers that question. All right. Johanna, what else were you going to say? I interrupted you. I think there was a.
No, sorry. There was the idea of that Minnesota uses a 2-year, and I don't know if that's been addressed, whether you all would decide on 1 or 2 years as a line, as an issue to determine in terms
You
of.
mean the calculator?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And then the other thing was, I can't remember what the
2-year
other thing
makes
was.
sense just because a lot of calendars are in odd years this and even
Right.
years this. And if you don't look at both, then you know,
Right. And then multiple children. I feel like Minnesota might have the definition somewhere about how to deal with, I mean, that was something that Dr. Benor brought up in her questions. If you have multiple children with different schedules, but that may be, too much to try to cover, so.
It's just averaging, most states just average it, so, that's 30%, 50%, that's 40% time sharing. There's 2 children.
I see. If one parent, if one child, you get 30%, and one child, you get 50%, then you average it and say you get 40% of the time you get with the children. Okay. All right, well, it's 3:55. Latana, I always mispronounce your name, I apologize. Latana, can you tell us, I think we asked you to just give us some results overall from like the beginning of the time that we started this survey till now, what the numbers look like instead of just since the last time, just an aggregate of all of it. Were you able to do that?
Yes, Judge. I was able to pull that information from with help with our IT department. And I'll share, hopefully you guys can see.
Yeah.
Screen. Okay, I have 3 different screens
Great
going on.
graphic.
Thank you. So we pulled the results from the very end of March 30th until June the 30th. And so the next time that I report on this for next month's meeting, it'll be from May the 30th until July the 30th for August. So we still have the most voted on term as still the custodial, non-custodial parent at 2,455. Next is the primary parent, secondary parent in orange with 722 votes. Third is the receiver, pay-or in gray with 343 votes. Fourth is payee, pay-or in yellow, 341. Fifth is the greater time parent, lesser time parent in the kind of light blue, 277 votes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, the sixth one is the obligee, obligor in green at 157. And again, last we have our, well, it's not the lowest, but of course it's just the enter your own suggestions at 747. Again, with the lane stating that it's just people putting in all types of.
They're fussing about their DCSS case. That's the majority. I looked at that again this morning.
So that is really worthless too, as the blue is,
Right.
the dark blue.
Right. So that's what I want to say. Just ignore the 747. It has
That's
no
just
value.
everything else, and a lot of it is not even related to the survey.
Right.
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 Yeah, but just since beginning of March, it's just the front runner has just been to keep it the same, the custodial, non-custodial parent.
Yeah.
Where most of it is coming from, if it's coming from attorneys or.
I don't think we're Latana, remind me, I don't think we're capturing who they are, but it's been a bit since I've looked at that when we set it up. Do you remember?
Right. I mean, we can tell when we're going through it, we can kind of, with the jargon, language jargon, we can kind of figure out, like this seems like a.
Yeah, but we don't have a data field where they're identifying,
Right,
I'm a
yeah.
lawyer, I'm a judge,
Not
I'm a mom, I'm a
right.
dad, or whatever. Okay.
Right, no, that's
So
that.
we didn't capture that information, Judge, so we're not going to know.
No, and I can appreciate the anonymity. I just
That's what we were thinking of.
yeah, I just
But it is interesting that the primary parent, secondary parent, if we are looking to actually make a change there, that's a legitimate front runner when you compare it with the other items. And if you toss out CP, NCP.
yeah.
And they weren't aware that George is talking about getting a parenting time formula. They're.
No, this was really about just changing the terms because of the I don't know what word to
People
use.
not liking them.
Yeah. Folks who have significant time or any time really with their children don't like to be referred to as non-custodial parents. And I understand the statute means, you know, what it means, but just the and that's part of the reason why years ago I started using the primary, secondary, unless of course I had a case where my client had sole custody, then that I didn't use primary, secondary. I used custodial and non-custodial, you know. But I also can see the benefit in being consistent across the code. And, you know, the Georgia Child Support Commission, obviously we're dealing with child support, but using terminology that relates to and is consistent with other code sections. And of course, you know, I think that's why Katie liked receiver payor, because it was specifically about money and not about custody, you know.
And that's the way it's spelled in other parts of code, is that with the payer OR, because I mean, that's kind of puts off, you know, if you spell it with the OR rather than the ER.
Yeah, payor, yeah, instead of payer.
Yeah, I mean, Oregon uses paying parent and receiving parent, which is just plain speak, you know, to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, that's unfortunate that there's not more context to the survey, you know, because it does seem to overwhelmingly suggest keeping that language, but you know, it's not language that excites me for a time sharing adjustment. So,
Yeah.
Well, and because we have so many people, that 747 reminds me of an airplane. That is talking about, you know, that's a lot of who talks about keeping it as well, because I have found in looking at them that sometimes they'll select custodial, non-custodial, and then they'll go over to the field and select and make a comment, you know, and sometimes they're really ugly. We've had some curse words in there and so forth, and, you know,
Wow.
talking about how they don't like that other parent, and they'll put some sort of comment in there in the other field.
Mhm.
So my point in saying that is that I don't think there's anything that says the commission, and Judge, with all due respect, your position on there, maybe the commission doesn't have to go with what the majority is saying here.
Well,
And
I feel confident we don't. This was a
Right.
tool in our toolbox to help
Right.
us have this discussion, but it was not a vote as the highest number wins.
Exactly. So
something
this
that
was
we
just to
can-
see what are people saying out there. So it's
Yeah.
an interesting, you know, an interesting bit of information.
Yeah.
But certainly the commission makes its own decision.
Yeah. All right. Well, Latana, thank you for that update. I know there are some things on our agenda that we did not get to, and we knew we weren't going to get to them. We purposely just keep putting them over because we don't want to lose track of them. And I don't want to keep y'all any longer, but maybe we'll discuss whether or not we ought to put them on the next agenda, or maybe we ought to move them out a bit since they just keep getting put off and put off. But for now, it is past our time to end our session, and it's 4:03. And if no one has any further important business to address today, we will end our session with the understanding that our next meeting for the Statute Review Subcommittee is August the 18th at 1:30 p.m. And we have another one scheduled for the Statute Review Subcommittee, if you want to put it on your calendars, for September 21st at 10 a.m. So that's August 18th at 1:30 p.m. and September 21st at 10 a.m. Both of those meetings will be conducted in a Zoom webinar, and the information should be on the commission's website. Our next full commission meeting, as we stated earlier in our meeting today, is going to be August the 11th at 10 a.m. And that's a hybrid meeting, which you can be attended in person or via webinar, and that information will also be on the commission's website. Anything else from anyone? All right, well, y'all have a very good weekend. Thank you all for attending. I feel like we got, we're really starting to pare this down and get some sort of concrete recommendations and ideas now.
Yes. Very glad.
All right, thank y'all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.